Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today. This is BrowserStack's webinar where we're going to talk about how you can shift left and the role of design in accessibility. We're so excited to have all of you here. And yeah, I think we're going to cover a little bit about how you can make accessibility a natural part of the product development process, and rather than as a last minute fix, we'll also explore why shifting left for accessibility can help you save time, cut costs, and how it leads to a better experience overall, not just for the specially able people, but for all of us using the internet. Next slide, please. All right. So we have a pretty exciting panel with us today. We obviously have me. My name is Karthik. I am the Senior Account Executive and an Accessibility Specialist here at BrowserStack. I'm going to be your host and moderator for today's session. Joining me are two more experts in the field of accessibility. I'm thrilled to introduce to Jared Smith. Jared is the executive director of WebAIM, one of the most respected organizations in digital accessibility. Jared has over 2 decades of experience and has been at the forefront of making the web more inclusive for everyone. If any of you guys have used the Wave tool or looked at the WebAIM Million report, please know that Jared had and his team had a significant role to play in it. Jared, would you like to say a few words?
Hey, and yeah, welcome. I appreciate the invitation to be here. WebAIM has web accessibility in mind. We're a nonprofit based at Utah State University, and yeah, as was mentioned, we've been doing web accessibility for a long time. We just celebrated 25 years of web accessibility at WebAIM, and I'm just excited to be here and talk about this important topic.
That's great to know, Jared. And the next time, just a heads up, the next time when I meet a customer that's using Wave, I'm going to let them know that I know the guy who helped build it. Oh, all right. I also have another expert with me, Avik. He's our product manager at BrowserStack, and he's really the brains behind helping us design the BrowserStack design accessibility product. And he's been instrumental in helping us develop it and helping us scale it as well. Avik, would you like to give us a small intro?
Hey, thanks everyone for joining this webinar. So my name is Avik and I work as a product manager at BrowserStack. I lead the development of the design accessibility Figma plugin here at BrowserStack. And in my development process, I've interacted with a lot of customers across Europe and US and excited to share all of those learnings with all of you folks here today.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Avik. As a friend and colleague, I'm really excited to have you here to be talking to you. And with that, we can go to the next slide, please. Perfect. So just a few housekeeping items, as I'm sure everyone knows. The session is going to run for an hour. At the end, we'll have about 10 to 15 minutes reserved for a Q&A, where we'll try to take up as many questions as we can. The entire session will be recorded and the recording will be made available to all the participants. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type those in the Zoom Q&A box in the screen below. We'll address them in the Q&A session at the end. But we have the users, all the audience members muted so that there's no interruption during the conversation. But without further ado, let's dive right in. All right. I know you guys can have a look at the agenda on your screen, but while you guys read it, what I want to emphasize on is what we're going to talk about is, first up, what exactly is shift left accessibility? I know we hear this term a lot, but what does it actually mean in practice? And then there's the big question, like why should you even care about shifting left? Is it just another industry jargon, or does it actually make life easier in tangible manner? We'll also break down some quick wins and long-term gains that come with making accessibility a priority early on in the SDLC. And of course, we cannot shift left without having our designers having a huge role to play in this case. And since we have one of those a week from BrowserStack on call, we'll talk a little bit about how you can bake accessibility right from the start instead of retrofitting it in a later. And then we'll do a quick demo of how BrowserStack can help you with that and enable you, followed by a Q&A at the end. Next slide, please. All right. So I know, shifting left refers to moving tasks and processes earlier in the software development life cycle, but what does it mean for accessibility? And I guess this is where, Jared, we need your expert opinion. Can you help us understand the concept of shifting left when it comes to specifically for accessibility?
Sure. So, generally that idea of shifting left, as you mentioned, is moving things earlier. If we think of a kind of a traditional software development life cycle, it tends to be a little more linear. Of course, there are a lot of different approaches to this, but usually would start with planning and requirements. And as I describe this, you might think about where accessibility lives in these cycles, or maybe where it most often occurs, and maybe where it would better occur. But we have planning and requirements, and then we move kind of left to right to if we were to graphically or visually lay this out, then we move to a design stage, then we start to code and build and develop, and then typically the next step is where most of our testing tends to occur. That usually is a place where accessibility tends to happen. And then we launch and kind of put this thing into production, and then we tend to have these cycles of kind of assessment and improvement and measuring along the way. So kind of this linear process, the idea of is shifting left, moving accessibility earlier in that process. So I mentioned accessibility tends to most often happen in that testing phase, usually just before we launch or make significant changes to our products. I get calls all the time from folks that say, oh, my application, my website is, going live next week. We'd like some help with accessibility. And, that's kind of the first step where they've really have considered accessibility after things have already been coded and built and are basically just in this little very short testing cycle before things are launched into production. And at that point, it's very difficult to address accessibility, especially because accessibility at that point really is a remediation task, right? You're just simply fixing bugs and fixing issues. And we'll talk more about the difficulties of that and why that isn't very effective. And so the idea of shifting left is moving accessibility and the priorities and definitions and requirements for accessibility earlier in that process, testing much earlier in that process to hopefully head off many of those accessibility issues that would more traditionally be caught in that QA or testing stage of that software development lifecycle. So that's basically what the idea of shifting left is. It's important, I think, that we keep our overall view of what accessibility is about, and it being about the user experience. Sometimes we view accessibility just as meeting these requirements or accessibility standards or guidelines, and that's important because it helps encourage a better user experience. But I think part of shifting left is also shifting the focus of accessibility more onto the user experience than it is simply on testing and guidelines and standards and checking these boxes for accessibility. What that results in is a better product, something that's more usable, more accessible for your users. And we can go to the next slide, please. Another significant benefit of this idea of shifting left is the cost savings that come into this. And I spend a lot of time trying to motivate people about accessibility and to really consider what this is about and why it's important. But this is one way to think about the benefits of accessibility. This graphic shows what's called BEM's curve. So BEM was a kind of software engineering economics professional and expert. And he developed this curve essentially that says, the longer we wait in that software development life cycle to identify and remediate defects, the more expensive it's going to be. And so this has numbers on it. Essentially, if we address the defect early in requirements, essentially has no cost, right? We're alleviating the defect before it's even introduced. If we identify it in design, it costs 5 times more. If we identify it and remediate it in the development process or building process, it's 20 times more expensive. In testing, 50 times, and then once it's in production, 150 times. I don't know about the numbers. These are maybe a little imaginary numbers, but the principle, I think, is very sound. That the longer we wait to identify these issues and then remediate them, it's going to be significantly more expensive than doing it early. So this, I think, really highlights the benefits of that shifting left. It's going to make things much more effective and cost effective for implementing that accessibility.
Absolutely. I think thank you so much for sharing that. Jared, we get a lot of clients also, coming in like this, and everyone sort of playing catch up to accessibility issues once things have gone into production. In my observation, leaving accessibility for later usually, like you mentioned, leads to a lot of rework, a huge backlog, and definitely a lot of unhappy developers, because the last thing any of those guys need is another Jira ticket coming their way. Uh, what I'd love to know from you, Jared, is to maybe get your thoughts on this. And could you share a story about a team that saved time or money by, catching these issues earlier, someone that you might have interacted or worked with?
Yeah. Yeah. As we consider some of these benefits, why we should be shifting left. I think these are things that many of you have probably experienced. Maybe not even just with accessibility, but if we delay accessibility testing, we tend to get a lot of these tickets and issues that are identified, and they tend to really pile up, right? One thing I can say quite definitively is that if you're at least anything more than maybe a very small organization, if your accessibility approach is focused only on remediation, there will be no end to the accessibility tickets, right? You will probably introduce accessibility issues and identify defects faster than they can be remediated. And so then the solution becomes like more and more testing, more and more remediation, and it just tends to pile up. We also tend to find in that approach that that accessibility issues sometimes are really significant, even in production, right? So we have users, they're reporting that, hey, things are totally inaccessible to me, blind users, keyboard users, things like that. And then, that can have a significant impact on the functionality of something if something inherently is not accessible. And then we have to go clear back to kind of design processes and rebuilding and remediating these things. There's also this real, last minute crunch. People that call me a few days before their product's launching, and then there's in this real panic because significant accessibility issues have been identified. Another real issue with waiting on accessibility is there's a lot of this back and forth and finger pointing. Design says, oh, the developers, they're the ones that coded this thing wrong, and developers say, well, if you would have identified what we needed to do, then that would have been important. Then design says, well, the requirements people, they didn't
Yeah.
tell us that this had to be accessible. And then we have QA all stuck in the middle of this, and they get a lot of heat for identifying these accessibility issues. And sometimes that can be really painful because QA folks may be able to identify the presence of accessibility issues, but may not always know best what caused or how to remediate those accessibility issues. And so they may not even know where to point, right? Is this a design? Is it requirements? Is it, is it the developer's fault? And you just get a lot of this finger pointing and real, sometimes chaos around accessibility. That concept of shifting left is going to make things a lot more streamlined, right? Fewer issues to identify because we're getting rid of those before they even occur. We're saving time and cost, as was represented by BEM's curve. We're being compliant, right? And hopefully we're meeting those compliance requirements before things are put into production and are live to our users. And hopefully everybody's a little happier with each other, right? Across our teams. There's a lot more efficiency and this common sense of working together as opposed to against each other. I can go ahead and go to the next slide. One case study, as you asked for, that we worked with was PayPal. We worked with PayPal for a long time. And when we first began to engage with PayPal, they asked us to come in and do training for their QA teams. And, so we kind of talked to them about how, how to best implement accessibility, but they said, we want to focus on QA. That's where accessibility happens here. And so we came in, we taught their QA folks, and then their QA started to test for and identify accessibility issues. And we got all this finger pointing, they primarily pointed at the developers. And so they had us back. We trained their developers about accessibility, and that helped, right? So then QA and developers were on kind of the same team, but there was still a lot of tension between kind of requirements and systems people and the designers and the folks that were actually doing accessibility later, right, further right in that process. And so then they started to realize some of these inefficiencies and the tension between these teams. And so then they brought in kind of more of the business processes and requirements people, kind of project managers, and got them up to speed on accessibility. And that really helped. But designers still weren't part of this, right? So designers were saying, no, you've got to build this thing this way. It has to look this way. And everyone else was saying, oh, but, there are accessibility issues with that. And so there was still that tension. So we came back and got designers. And at that point, we were shifting left, right? Every one of these stages, we were shifting further left. And then that really helped with the accessibility. But there were still a lot of issues. Not everybody was doing it. Not everybody was entirely on board with accessibility. So the next step was to really get leadership. And once the leadership understood accessibility and its benefits and how important it was, they were then messaging to the entire organization that this is what we're going to do. We are going to build accessibly. And that kind of then captured everybody within the organization to understand how critical accessibility was, and then things began moving much more smoothly, and accessibility was really implemented pretty well. And so that's kind of the idea of shifting left. Now, PayPal probably doesn't have perfect accessibility, but it's one case study that we've seen that kind of implemented this in a way that resulted in a lot of efficiencies.
Absolutely. I think, a couple of things that stand out. There's always that resistance, that mindset change that needs to happen to be able to visualize it going, away from a traditional way of doing it. And there's always that leadership buy-in that needs to be there. And when both of these things are combined, I think that certainly makes a very good case for it. But, Jared, shifting left sounds great. Can we go to the next slide, please? And I'm sure it's not without its challenges, this slide lists some of the big ones, like not knowing the right tools, maybe having a gap in expertise, or just thinking it'll slow things down. It could be that mindset change, like Jared talked about in the case of PayPal, that had to have happened. I think this is also a good point for us to maybe do a Zoom poll and try to see if from our audience, like, what do they think are the challenges stopping their team from shifting left? Is it lack of awareness, a learning curve for team members, perception that accessibility is time consuming, maybe not a priority for the company, or it could just even be no clear ownership in teams?
Or maybe all of the above, right? It could be many of these or other factors. There is a lot that goes into this, but yeah, we'd appreciate seeing your responses here to the poll.
Absolutely. And while we wait for them to respond and we get a final poll out of this, I would love to get some thoughts from you, Jared, as to what are some of the biggest challenges that companies face when shifting left. Are there any blockers that they have to overcome that can be perhaps generalized?
Yeah. Well, as far as real critical ones, I think we just talked about the need for leadership. That's captured in one of these, that's not a priority for the company. If we could go back to PayPal, and this is kind of the way that we tend to work more often now, is that, we try to get that leadership early in that commitment and buy-in and the resources for accessibility. I think that's an important one, but that's common. Sometimes things start with leadership and has to trickle down, but I think that's a real critical component to really making accessibility successful. The other ones listed here, lack of awareness of tools for accessibility. I think that's a big one. Accessibility is not a tooling problem. It's a human problem, but the tools really can help and help facilitate that accessibility. People ask us all the time about the cost of accessibility. You know, how much is it going to cost for us to do this? And our answer is it will always be a function of the knowledge of your teams. You know, the more they understand about accessibility, the less expensive it's going to be, especially if you do that early, right? Shifting left. So that you know, question there, or answer, the learning curve for team members is going to be a real big one. That's also going to impact the next one. You know, the perception that accessibility is time consuming. Accessibility can take time. It does. You know, all of design and development is about compromise, right? It's about putting effort into the places where it's going to result in the best outcomes, and accessibility is part of that, right? So that's another one there. And then no clear ownership in teams. I think that's one of the things the shifting left tends to address, is that accessibility doesn't live in one place, right? It's really an organizational thing. It happens everywhere. Everybody owns accessibility. Now, I think in an organization, it's also important to have maybe some key people that really get this, that implement it, that kind of own it, and can maybe be resources for the rest of the teams. But yeah, I just see the poll results here. Interesting.
Yeah.
Almost an even split across
Yeah.
all five of those, and I think that maybe highlights some of the complexities of accessibility, and there's a lot of challenges that need to be addressed in order for this to happen effectively.
Exactly, and like you mentioned earlier, some of the same things, some misconceptions that, like it could be time consuming or there can be a learning curve. We see sort of an even distribution between lack of awareness of tools, learning curve, as well as no clear ownership in teams, which are all sort of things that you alluded to in the example that you gave. But I think it's a good point for us to go to the next slide, please.
Yeah, so I wanted to take just a minute and talk about the WebA Million. And I think this will highlight and provide some insight into this concept of shifting left and give us a better picture of where we're at currently with accessibility on the web. The WebAIM Million is a research study that WebAIM does once per year. It's an analysis of the accessibility of the top 1 million homepages on the web. And so we use the Wave tool. We do a crawl or scan across the million pages and detect a lot of accessibility things, technology features that are in place, and then we publish this annual report. Our 2025 report will be published here in just a couple weeks. You are the very first people outside of WebAIM to actually get a bit of a sneak peek into the results of our 2025 study that we're just in the middle of writing up our new report. Again, it'll be published here in a couple of weeks. But if we look at the number of detectable errors on average per page, lots of accessibility errors or potential barriers, 51 this year, which is a slight improvement from last year. We did see this a little bit of a bump from like 50 or 51 to like 56 last year, then it's back down this year. Hopefully that's a trend of some improvement. We used a slightly different sampling method last year and this year, but this does maybe suggest some improvement, but still 51 errors, right? That's like 1 in every 20 or 30 elements on the average homepage, like things that a user could see or interact with, has some sort of accessibility potential barrier. That's really impactful for users with disabilities. So there's a lot of issues out there on the web. Next slide. If we look across those million pages, 95% of pages have detectable web content accessibility guidelines failures. And that's down from 97.8% in 2019. So we've seen about a 3% improvement over the course of the last 6-7 years, right? Very, very slow improvements as far as overall detectable issues. Now this is only automatically detectable failures. That would because Many of the requirements for accessibility, the guideline requirements, are not detectable with automated tools. This would suggest that the actual conformance rate is very, very low. If we were to, kind of project forward with this trend, that would maybe mean that we could maybe expect full conformance with accessibility guidelines in about 200 years. If you're at all an advocate for accessibility, I hope you can see that just is not acceptable, right? We have to accelerate and improve the rate of accessibility on the web. So in short, there's a lot of work to be done yet with accessibility, and we can consider why this is occurring. One of those reasons why I think we're seeing such slow progress is shown on the next slide, if you want to jump to it. And this shows the number of homepage elements. So the number of things, buttons, links, divs, spans, any type of HTML element on these home pages. There is significant increase in the size of home pages. We're seeing, this year, 1,257 elements on average on home pages across the web. This is about a 9 or 10% increase per year. This is kind of alarming. How do we keep up with a 9 or 10% bloat of page elements on the average homepage? How does accessibility keep up with that? And I think a lot of what's influencing this significant growth of elements is external and third-party libraries and frameworks that are being used. That introduces a lot of technical debt. What we're finding more and more with organizations, especially large organizations, is that many of them don't own or control their code, maybe only a small portion of it. They're primarily using these external frameworks and libraries, and that's where the accessibility issues tend to be addressed, which makes it very difficult to address those accessibility issues if you're reliant on third-party frameworks and libraries. And so anyway, just something for us to think about, if we could maybe address the complexity of the web and the bloat of the web and allow organizations more control over their own code, that's going to also necessitate a better understanding of HTML. I think that we would really start to address that accessibility and maybe see some acceleration in improvements on the web when it comes to accessibility. And the key to a lot of this is shifting left.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point, Jared. You know, to me, it sounds like over the last since 2019, you mentioned there's only been a 3% improvement in the detectable issues. That's quite slow progress. I hope we are able to make much more progress on that front. But I think some of the most common issues that can be caught early on, and by shifting left are, like low contrast, missing alt text, missing input labels, and all the rest that are mentioned on your screen. Next slide, please. And I think what I would love to understand, Jared, is could you walk us through these issues and how do you test for them early on in the SDLC?
Yeah, those issues that were listed there are the ones that are most common on the web. In fact, the vast majority of those accessibility issues that are detectable on the web fall into those categories. And so, focusing just on those issues would have significant impacts on accessibility across the web. The other thing is those things are easily detectable and generally pretty easily addressable, right? They're easy to be fixed and remediated. So again, this idea of shifting left and identifying these things earlier, poor color contrast, that's we tend to think of that as primarily like a design thing, right? And I think it mostly is. But I think there are some things when it comes to color contrast that that can are maybe more systems types of things, right? And requirements and maybe commitment to accessibility, but certainly identifying that earlier. Um, most of the design tools that are out there, Figma and so forth, and we'll have a demo here a little bit later, have contrast checking built into them. But I think this is kind of an awareness thing of earlier in design and requirements to know what contrast is and the impact of it. Keyboard navigation and focus order. This is one that's difficult to detect, failures in an automated way, but really impactful on users when the navigation order of things is not logical or intuitive, or even more so if things are not keyboard accessible. And so, identifying the navigation order, speccing that out so it can be defined before it gets to development, it will help ensure that that navigation order is going to be appropriate. Just a quick kind of technical thing here. The solution here is not tab index, right? Sometimes developers say, "Oh, I have to define a navigation order," so they use code to do that.
Yeah.
Specific attributes. Really, the solution is just having the natural source code order define that navigation order. So I'm just using layout and design to stipulate what that navigation order will be naturally through that page. Non-text contrast is another one. So low contrast of graphical elements like checkboxes and buttons and things like that is another one, again, that can be defined and specified early in that design process. Alt text, alternative text for images, other non-text elements, another one, real critical. I think when it comes to alt text, one thing to consider is who is the best person to determine the alternative text for images. Very often what happens, is an image is designed and put into a design, and then it's passed over the wall of the cubicle to developers, right? And then they are like, "Oh, I don't, this image looks like this," and they define the alternative text. Or maybe even in a QA process, "Oh, there is no alt text, it should be this." This is really an area where we need to shift left. Who is the person that should best be determining the content of that image as defined in the alternative text? It really should be the kind of the content people, right? That's a piece we kind of haven't talked about as much as, who is it that's defining the content itself, not just designing what it looks like, but actually specifying the content. Alternative text is content. Those are the people that would best be defining alternative text. Of course, that means that they understand the principles of alternative text. So yeah, these are just a few examples of the things that can be shifted left in ways that are going to have better impact on accessibility.
Absolutely. And how can automated testing best be implemented in this process, if at all?
Yeah, no, it can. A lot of these things are going to can be tested early, even in design, which I think is awesome. With some of the design tools that are out there, have better accessibility testing. Early in development processes as well. Building these things into CI/CD processes. Early in code, much before it's like publicly available and can be scanned with more popular, scanning accessibility tools, is going to help identify these defects and allow them to be addressed more meaningfully before we get way right in that process, and then suddenly it's a real issue when it comes to accessibility and a potential liability issue because it's now being presented to our end users. So the automated tools have a role there, but folks need to understand what those tools can and can't do and how to best implement them. And so I said, accessibility isn't a tooling issue, but tools can really help with this.
Understood. Thank you for sharing that, Jared. That was really insightful. I think catching these early opportunities starts with design. We cannot get there without our designers. And let's deep dive into how design can play a huge role in making this shift left approach work. And at this point, I would like to hand it off to Avik to talk a little bit more about it.
Sure, thanks, Karthik. Thanks, Jared. So from this section onwards, we'll be talking specifically about the role of design and shifting left. And I'd like to start this section with a poll. Can we have the poll? Yep. So I want you folks to tell me how many success criteria, WCG success criteria, can be addressed by designers. So until we get in the answers, I think there's one very obvious answer. Can we move on to the next slide? So color contrast, very obviously something that designers can definitely take care of. But yeah, so if we could have the results of the poll also, that would be great. But yes, as per my understanding and what I've encountered after talking to designers is that apart from color contrast, there are about 27 WCAG success criteria that designers can directly address in their workflow. So color contrast is one, but there can be other things like info and relationships, for example, defining the heading hierarchy, right? Or things like focus visible, which means when you're defining a component, should you put a clear focus indicator around it? Or say non-text content, which is defining alternative text for images or defining what are decorative images and so on. So all of these success criteria that you see on your screen can be addressed by designers in some way or the other, either as a fix that you can do in design or as a handoff that you will do to your developers, right? So Jared, keeping this in mind, maybe you can translate to us what the four principles of WCAG, right? That perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. How can you give me quick examples of how designers can action on each of those four principles in their workflows?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, you can see this is from the poll results. This is a bit of a tricky question, right? Because a lot of it, you could interpret this question as to being like, what is this my primary responsibility, right? And designers can certainly directly impact things like contrast, but there are a lot of other things they can define, they can specify um, in that software development life cycle to help address those accessibility issues. And there may be more than even the 27 that they can influence. It's just this tricky thing. The idea is we want designers to be thinking more broadly and holistically about accessibility, and one way to do that is to focus on those principles of accessibility. Again, perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust, which are the foundation of the web content accessibility guidelines. But even another shift left, maybe from that, is thinking about the user experience. You know, there's a lot more of to even contrast accessibility than just like the contrast of foreground and background. There's focus states, there's various states within things like links and buttons. If you hover over it, if you navigate to it, what will that do? There's contrast that can be impacted by user settings on the end. The idea is just really focusing more on that real user experience, not just what designers want things to look like. Things sometimes tend to be designed for designers and not so much designed for end users. One thing I would really recommend that can be beneficial here is user stories, right? So personas and thinking about users, especially in including users with disabilities or disability types as part of those user personas, and then building your requirements around those personas can help you better focus on, again, the user experience, those principles of accessibility, and beyond that, you're going to be better addressing many of these accessibility requirements or guidelines or success criteria.
Right, right. So next slide, please. Yep. So just like Jared mentioned earlier in this in the graph that started this webinar, is that design decisions have a large impact on accessibility. Right? The cost of fixing issues drastically goes up towards if you keep them for later. And it's estimated that around more than 60% of issues can be addressed during the design phase itself. Right? So that's how much impact you can have if you address issues early. Right? So now let's look at a process where how do you build a process where designers can continuously contribute to accessibility? And next slide, please. Yep. So if this is your software development lifecycle, right from the planning stage to measure stage, there are different parts where designers can contribute to accessibility. And this is a roadmap that you can follow as an organization if you're low on accessibility maturity or if you think you can do better. Next slide. Yep. So designers can get involved at all of these stages. Maybe at the planning stage, if you have existing websites or digital properties, you can audit and identify issues in them. You can collaborate with your PMs, product managers to understand which success criteria to follow. At the actual design stage, you can do the real heavy lifting as a designer by fixing violations, creating documentation around user experience, keyboard interactions, screen reader navigation, like reading order, right? At the testing stage, designers can get involved in validating some fixes, doing sanity checks. At the measure stage, you can monitor, just go through your key journeys on once your website or app is live and keep on monitoring them. But there's one more way. We've been talking about shift left, but you can shift even more lefter by addressing them in your design system or component library itself. Next slide. So if you want to make an impact that is even more scalable throughout your organization, you can plan out your design system at the planning stage. When you're building your component library in the second stage of design, you can use contrasting color combinations, create a color palette that has distinct colors. Your buttons, your accessible components should be accessible, right? At the testing stage, when you deploy your components in something like a storybook, you can test those components using any tool like BrowserStack's web accessibility tools, right? And finally, at the measure stage, you can keep a track of how many components you have made accessible, which WCAG guidelines do they comply with, and where can you do better, right? With that, I would walk into the demo part of the webinar. Right. So let me share my screen. So up until now, a lot of the issues that we have been talking about that can be addressed at the design system or the design interface stage can be addressed using the BrowserStack Accessibility Design Toolkit. So this toolkit can be found on the Figma community page, and the plugin page looks something like this. And I'm going to show you a few examples of how you can run this tool on an interface and make your interfaces accessible, and how you can run it on your component libraries to make your components accessible. Right. So I have a sample artboard here of a design, and I'll just launch my BrowserStack Accessibility Design Toolkit. And this is how the plugin looks like. And if you launch it, you'll see two major functionalities here. One is for scanning your layouts, and one is for scanning your components. And but color contrast being the most common issue for every designer, what you can do is you can just select any text layer on your design, and you can see whether it passes or fails WCAG, AA, and AAA criteria. So this is for quickly eyeballing through your designs, and if anything looks off, you can just check the color contrast of that. Right? If it passes, it's green, it's good. If it fails, it's red. So that means you'll have to change your colors until it passes. So that's for quickly checking color contrast. But if you want to do a more comprehensive check, you can just select your frame and click on scan layout. And here you have two modes of scanning your layout. Either you will have a way of selecting scanning your web designs or your mobile designs. Most of the checks are same, but there are slight differences in some checks. So I'll just give you a walkthrough of how the website scan looks like. Right. So some of these checks here are automated, some are semi-automated, and some that you have to take care of manually, right? So things that you can fix as a designer are color contrast, right? So you see that the plugin has listed all issues of color contrast and grouped them together if they're similar in nature, right? So all three layers are similar in nature. So you can just go ahead and select all those three common results and fix them in one go, right? So if you think you're done with that, you can click on done, and you can fix all your issues, use your style tokens maybe to make your color contrast compliant, and you're done. So that's one automated check taken care of. And if you're done with this, this is also a checklist that you can click on mark as done. And the next automated check that you can take care of is target size. So if you're trying to comply with WCAG 2.2 guidelines, this is a necessary check for you, where all your interactive elements on screen should meet certain size and spacing criteria. So for example, WCAG 2.2 AA gives this criteria and AAA gives this criteria, right? So the plugin automatically detects some interactive elements on your screen, and it shows in green if it passes. If it fails, it would have shown in red, right? So that's an automated check taken care of. If it passes, you're done, and mark is done. Next up, is, as a designer, you can also create handoffs for your developers. So those handoffs can comprise of what is the heading hierarchy on your page, what is the focus order throughout your page, what are the different landmarks on your page, what are the different alt text, right? So let's have a look at some of them. So first of all, the plugin will suggest you what are the contenders for headings on your page. So the plugin tells you that there are these text layers that can be marked up as headings. So as a designer, you can take a call that this should be a top level heading, this should be a second level heading, and so on, or you can choose to ignore it, right? Once you do this, this kind of annotation gets added to your screen. This is for consumption by your developers. When they come to Figma, they'll know that these layers need to be marked up with H1 and H2 tags. You can also choose to do it manually, like you can choose a layer, one layer or multiple layers, and then tag them with the right heading tag. So that's one form of annotation. Another annotation that you can hand off to your developers is the focus order or the keyboard navigation order throughout the screen, right? So a lot of teams do it manually by drawing arrows or putting 1, 2, 3 numbering throughout all of the interactive elements. However, using this plugin, you can do it with fewer steps. What you have to do is select all the interactive elements on your screen, and it doesn't matter which order you select it in. For example, let me select all the buttons, all the links on this page, this breadcrumb, this side panel. Right, let me select this link here as well, and this button. So if you notice, I selected all of these in a random fashion. And if I click on add focus order, so the plugin has annotated a meaningful sequence of navigation throughout the screen. So it goes through the top navigation bar first, then it goes into the side navigation bar from top to bottom, then it goes into the main content, then it goes to the buttons inside it, and then the section inside it, and finally the bottom nav bar. So this is the plugin's recommended way of navigating throughout the screen. Of course, you can choose to ignore it, or you can rearrange some bit of it. For example, you can move around elements and it will rearrange your focus order. That's one form of annotation that you can leave for developers. Another common one is image alt text. So on this page, there are no images, but if you have a image heavy landing page, for example, a landing page like this, you can just scan it. And using the plugin, you can annotate, you can mark any image as informative or decorative, and you can add an alt text to it. For example, this is an informative image, and maybe there's a decorative image here that does not need to be called out by a screen reader. So once the designer does this in the plugin, there's a handoff that's generated for the developer. When they come and consume this design, they will know which are the designs, which are the images that need an alt tag and which ones are decorative. And finally, if you have to look at your designs through the lens of someone who is colorblind, then you can use this vision simulator and look at your designs through the lens of 8 color blindness conditions. So that's how you make your layouts accessible using fixes and handoffs. But I'll quickly go through the components part as well. If you have a component and a component set in this fashion, like a button component set with all its variants, a focus state, a disabled state, an active state, etc. You just select it, click on scan component. And once you scan the component, there will be guidelines that are generated that are very specific to that component. For example, it has detected color contrast issues for these labels. Then it has detected that there are it has also run a scan for touch target sizing. So it tells you whether your buttons pass the size criteria for AA, AAA guidelines. And then there are some guidelines that you have to manually take care of. For example, if your button's focus state should have a visible ring around it. It should pass the color contrast ratio. And then you have suggestions which help you go beyond accessibility and make it truly inclusive. For example, things like, have a distinct loading state, have a distinct disable state, etc. right? The plugin also helpfully highlights you which are the disabled states that you need to look at. I'll just quickly show an example of another component so that you know the variety of guidelines that you would get. For example, if you have a checkbox, the guidelines would be slightly different. Yeah, so color contrast and touch target sizing remain same. However, there are some different guidelines. If you're scanning a checkbox, for example, guidelines relating to a label and grouping of checkboxes are other things that you as a designer can take care of, right? And this is also a checklist that you can keep marking off as you go along. And when you come back to the plugin, you can always see which components or which layouts have you scanned, what's their status, so that you can resume wherever you left off working. And this is your history of scans. So that's the BrowserStack accessibility design toolkit. I'll stop my demo here.
All right. Thank you so much for that, Avik. That looked amazing. I am having active conversation with some of our enterprise clients, who are trying to build that business case internally to get time and resources to make it up for themselves. And I think, thank you so much for taking the time and walking us through that. I know we are almost at the end of the time, but what you're seeing on your screen is BrowserStack's entire accessibility suite of capabilities. So we can help you obviously shift left and come in right at the design stage with a Figma plugin. But we also have a web testing suite, a mobile app testing suite, as well as PDF scanning options. Or if you're looking for accessibility services, audits, or VPAT reports, we have those also ready for you as well. We can help you, automate your accessibility tests, or if you want to have an manual approach, please know that we can assist you with that as well. And we do it on real devices, screen readers, and the rest. This is the perfect moment for you to answer this particular poll that is being shown on your screen. But at the same time, we'll also take up some questions that we might have. All right, so we'll take the first one that I see. How would you suggest handling the idea of specific accessibility requirements for user stories? For example, if a new page is added, how might a team have specific things to look for when developing to meet some of the most basic accessibility requirements? Have you ever seen some process like that work well?
Yeah, so a couple ideas. First of all, that if you have user stories, that's wonderful, right? I think that's already going to give you some advantage in this accessibility process, especially because user stories are defined early in that process, right? That's already indicative of shifting left. Those user stories are generally based on personas, and I've seen organizations that define accessibility or disability characteristics for all personas, and all of those user stories of what's going to happen. And I think that's a great way to do this. Instead of just having, Mark is a screen reader user, right? And that's kind of his persona, a screen reader user. Define these other characteristics of that, define the user story. Oh, and by the way, Mark is using a screen reader. Or a persona for somebody that has tremors in their hands, right, where target size may be an issue, or is a little bit older and has some visual contrast acuity difficulties. We're perceiving lower contrast things are going to be more difficult, and so just kind of layering these accessibility things onto those personas and onto those user stories is beneficial. I think you can extend that a little bit more, though, by defining the accessibility requirements that are relevant to that particular persona and user story. So, defining maybe the WCAG success criteria or the test components that are going to be necessary. Kind of extend that persona, right? So not only is it somebody with maybe tremors in their hands where small things might be difficult, but what are the actual tests that need to be completed? What are the actual success criteria that are relevant to that? And then having that kind of follow that user story through the software development lifecycle provides a lot of touch points for that accessibility to be addressed. Not only considering the user story and the persona, but the actual test, the actual success criteria, doing that through that process just makes it a whole lot easier to ensure that those accessibility issues are identified and addressed earlier, right, or earlier in that life cycle. So those are sort of a few ideas.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for addressing that, Jared. I hope, Bob, that was your question. I hope that helped answer or give some more insights into that. In the interest of time, I think we'll probably take one more question. My organization has little accessibility experience, but strong buy-in. I've just assembled a working group to steer our shift left. What process can you recommend to enable our group become leaders for the rest of the org? Use BrowserStack for Figma.
Yeah, I mean, that's it. Yeah, those tools are going to be great. First of all, the fact that you have this buy-in is really powerful, right? A lot of accessibility is selling it, right? Is building that commitment and just understanding of accessibility. I think the training is really an important component to this, just so folks understand what this is, right? They talk about accessibility, but accessibility by its nature tends to be fairly technical, and so having some knowledge building capacity in this process is going to be important. If you have that sufficient commitment, that's gonna should naturally drive that training and education. That having that training be a little more customized to the roles of those individuals. Design training is going to be different than QA training, but the fundamental principles are going to be the same. That would be probably the niche recommendation, is just building that knowledge capacity. And then from that, the things like tooling, right? What are the best tools to use? Where are the best places to really implement different aspects of accessibility? Is going to happen a lot more naturally, rather than just kind of shooting from the hip and hoping that this works without a real understanding of accessibility. The only other thing maybe I'd suggest there is, I mentioned this earlier, is somebody to really lead the effort, somebody that really does understand accessibility, not that is doing the accessibility, but is a touch point, right? As a resource for those that are going to be doing accessibility throughout the organization, that they can come to if they have questions, if they're running into challenges, someone that can maybe lead those training efforts, for new staff, as there's turnover, making sure that new folks are brought up to speed. So having an accessibility champion that understands accessibility is another important point here.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Jared. I hope, Michael, that answered your question and gives you some more insights into how you can structure that and go about navigating it. In the interest of time, I think, thank you so much, everyone, for your questions and for your time and attending this. Also to the panelists, both Jared and Avik, really grateful for having all of you here. Due to the time constraints, we will have to pause taking any more questions. In case there are some that haven't been answered, please be assured we will reach out to you offline with the answers. But thank you again for taking the time. And before we wrap up, I know we covered, accessibility, shifting left, WCAG guidelines, everything. But fundamentally, we are making the internet a more inclusive place for someone who's specially abled and for everyone else as well. And this quote from Jonathan J. Kaufman just stood out to me, and we thought that, we must not forget what accessibility was intended out to be and how it helps specially abled people. And we'll just let it sit there for a second so that you can have a look at it. End of our webinar. Thank you so much, everyone, for your time. Thank you, both the panelists, for taking out the time, and the audience members. We hope this was helpful and it gave you some new, fresh ideas that you can take back and implement. And if you're interested in exploring BrowserStack's accessibility testing further, or have any other follow-up questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. We're more than happy to help you guys. Thank you so much again, and have a great day, everyone.